We are having technical issues. It kind of reminds me back in the days of hybrid teaching at the height of COVID when issues would arise. But we'll continue to try to work out those kinks so that our friends who are joining remote can help enjoy the festivities and our celebration of the one and only, incomparable, and of course, I'm talking about Judith, not you. Brook Baker. So Brook is surrounded here today with family, with Judith by his side and working with him as we've seen through the years. We also have Brook's two sons, Chad on Zoom, who we hope will be joining us soon. Also Breton. Breton is here. And joined by their daughter-in-law, Cassandra Pierre, who's here. Almost. Oh, okay, all right. Very good. And his brother, Gary. Gary, who you guys kind of look alike, but that's all good. So it's great that we're here with Brook and his family, and also obviously his friends and colleagues. We have a esteemed group of speakers who are going to speak to Brook and his many years of accomplishment. So I'm not going to do a lot in that regard, but I'll say a few things that I'm sure will come out in the course of the presentations. All of us who know Brook know that he's a tireless advocate. I think that's kind of one description that sums it up. With a ferocity, and one of the images that kind of came up was AIDS pirateers or something. Profiteers. This is you know. But ferocity always accompanied with compassion. So even when Brook calls you a profiteer, it's with compassion. So that's always been appreciated by me as one of his colleagues. Now, the compassion does not extend to the basketball court. We know this. When I go on alumni events and people recall their days at Northeastern, you know, and thinking about Brook when he comes up in conversation, basketball comes up, Jack Agar comes up, I think with the same cringe, but anyway, but they both come up, and also Brook's passion with regard to health advocacy and global health that he worked on towards the kind of middle portion of your career, we might say. And this tremendous trajectory. I was working my way through Brook's CV, and it took me a long time, 63 pages. That's a lot of accomplishments, brother. So, all the way from a textbook on legal writing, I think 2001 or so, to all of your spectacular work with regard to the AIDS crisis and more recently COVID. And I remember vividly as a colleague when Brook kind of jumped into action with regard to the AIDS crisis with you know, a ferocity and a sense of purpose that I was always wowed by and astounded. And when we kind of think about that trajectory and all the work that he's done through the years and consider literally the lives that he's saved and the suffering that he has helped to alleviate is really amazing. And again, I know we'll hear a lot more about that in due course. So I'm going to pass the mic along to our first speaker, Liz Rogers. Liz?
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
There are very few professors I know, as well as, one second, I'm just going to rotate my little speech. I didn't know I'd be first. Hold on. Here it is. Okay. There are very few professors I know as well as Brook Baker, and I've known him longer than I've known my husband, my son, many judges, my law partners, and many of the professors in this room. From 2024 to 1973, that's when we met. 51 years last September. And we have practiced law together, we have taught together, we have met annually at National Lawyers Guild meetings. We have raised our families knowing of each other's dear love and struggle and achievement with our families. And so I was very honored to be asked to join with you. And so my job is to go back to those early years and to just talk about the first years when we were in law school together. And there are some members of our class of 1976 that go back to 1973 here today. We saw each other every day that first year in law school. And when our class made history in each other's lives, we came not to be famous, but to be of use. And we were coming to a law school that was the only one in the country where you could work your way through law school through internships in poverty law, in labor law, in indigenous land claims, wounded knee, prison rights. We were coming from a generation that was coming through several years of trauma and hope. And the trauma was that in 1968, we had lived through the assassination while we were undergraduates of Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy. We had lived through the closing of many universities in 1970 because of the invasion of Cambodia and the shootings at Kent State. The resonance with today's times and all the protests is particularly poignant to those of us who went to law school in '73, because our parents did not approve of my parents did not, and many of our parents did not. They were people who had fought in World War II. They were patriotic. They had enlisted. They were in favor of the Vietnam War, and they opposed all of these terrible protests. So there's an enormous resonance with us today. When we entered Northeastern Law School in September of 1973, Roe v. Wade was 6 months old. It had just been decided that women had a constitutional right to their own bodies, to choice. But at the same time, in 1973, when I'm looking at Judith and Judy, and we were all in Brooks' class, when we got there, virtually every pregnant woman and every school teacher could be fired for the crime of having a baby. A pregnant father would be hired so that he could support the family. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was trying to put together, if you remember, things that would change that. And she had a litany of cases in the pipeline. So when we went to law school, we were ready for action. And I would just say that Brooke was part of a small group used to organizing. He and Judith, where's Judith? I'm losing my visual contact with her. But he and Judith knew that in order to be successful organizing, they had helped shut down their university. So they knew that in order to be successful, you had to have personal relationships. And that has continued through his entire career. But what he helped with other people organize was a lakeside retreat for radical law students in Jaffrey, New Hampshire. And with his great leadership, he gathered all the radical students who had been chosen in part by Dan Gavelber, Judy Brown, and Steve Subrin in order to have a different kind of law school. They didn't know what they were asking for, but he organized us in that very first retreat in early September and led us all in skinny dipping. It was a sight to behold. We were young and we were beautiful. Anyway, but then David Weintraub sang An Angel from Montgomery, and we all got down to starting the first National Lawyers Guild chapter at Northeastern. And the National Lawyers Guild, most of us didn't even know what it was an alternative organization to the ABA that had been created in 1936 when the ABA did not accept black lawyers. And we were starting a radical chapter. So the first thing that we did in our very first criminal law course, it was being taught by Dan Gavelber. I think he was about 32. And if you just pause for a moment and think back, if you go back 50 years from now, you go back to 1922, 24. 21. If we had been told then that our teachers, I know what it was, that if we had been told then that our teachers had met 50 years before, that would have been 1923. We would have thought they were fossils. Luckily, we're still young and vibrant, but nonetheless. So when we got there, the very first protest was at this criminal law class. And the class had a criminal law textbook, a case book, and the very first case to teach us homicide, to teach us the difference between involuntary manslaughter, premeditation, malice aforethought, was a young, poor, black woman who had no access to education, no access to medical care, no access to contraception, no access to abortion. I don't remember, she might even have been raped. She gave birth in a toilet, and the very first thing we learned about homicide is, should she be prosecuted for homicide? And that was supposed to titillate us and excite us and let us think about, well, was it premeditated? Was she trying to get rid of a baby she didn't want? Or was it involuntary? Or was it all the way down to involuntary? So at that class, there were about 12 of us who were horrified. They were not putting that up there, as you might today, to say, what are the cultural and narrative themes that might emerge from the abuses of criminal law? No, this was just how to teach criminal law. So we cornered a guy named Dan Gavelber right outside that first class. There were 12 of us, and Brooke was there. And we had a fearless leader, Diana Hicks, who had long flowing blonde hair. She was from Montgomery, Alabama. And she said to Dan, how dare you teach a class with a woman with no health care and no doctor and no abortion right, no contraception right, and you're trying to tell us that should even be considered as a homicide? And Dan looked at us, and he's surrounded by these 12 people. He's picked them all individually. And he looks at them and he says, well, I don't think I said that. And if I did say it, I didn't mean it. And if I meant it then, I don't mean it now. And I tell you that at a retirement party because retirement is about the environment and the years that you live through with somebody. And that captures the way that our environment was shaped by professors who wanted us to challenge, wanted us to think, wanted us to change things, and were willing to accept, very occasionally, a mistake. So it's no surprise that I asked Brook Baker and Bob Schwartz to be my partner in moot court with a woman named Ann Gilmore. We had been volunteering, this is 1973, and at that time, the Equal Protection Clause really had just been decided that maybe you could challenge some challenges on the basis of equal protection in a case called Reed v. Reed. But shortly after that, they decided sex discrimination didn't include pregnancy discrimination, and there was a whole bunch of cases that were still to come that were bad. But we were right at a turning point. And because Brook had stood up with us about the woman in the first year class, we asked Brook and Bob Schwartz to come with us and be the partners. And Bob was very funny, and Brook was more serious. But Bob said, okay, we'll be your partner, but we have to represent the women, not the state. Because if I represent the state to prosecute the women, I'll never get laid again. That wasn't Brook, but I had to tell that because it was so funny. But anyway, but the Women's Law Collective in Cambridge, we were first year students. We didn't know anything about con law or anything. They asked us, can you do research on all of the cases in the pipeline about the Equal Protection Clause? So Brook and Bob, who later Bob went on to write a book about labor law that was produced for all sorts of labor union people. Brook went on for a generation of teaching people not only how to advocate, but also how to learn so that you could advocate. They learned every case in the pipeline, every case, and why it was arbitrary and why it was not reasonably related to the objective of the legislation and why it was contrary to the purpose of the Equal Protection Clause. And they argued so beautifully and masterfully and gave all that research to the Women's Law Collective. And Ann Gilmore and I, we represented the state because Judy and Dan and the powers that be said you did have to argue both sides at a moot court. And so Ann did all this research and found out that the ABA had researched why you prosecute. We decided the case that they used was prosecuting prostitutes and not the customers. Why it was illegal to sell sex but not to buy it, even though you engaged in the exact same behavior at the exact place with the same two bodies for the same price. But nevertheless, we argued based on an ABA research that we found that the men might be located in the brothel as sociologists. They also said that it wasn't fair to prosecute men who were buying sex because they were driven by uncontrollable urges, whereas the women were just driven by money, and that was a rational reason for regulating them. And the final thing was Ann and I came up with our own argument that because of the history of of well-known customers of prostitutes being politicians and powerful people for the ages throughout literature, and that the main purpose of prosecuting the women only was to preserve the important state interest in hypocrisy. And so, because there are some, okay, I'll stop. Northeastern faculty were there, and they had reached out to justices of the Massachusetts Appeals Court, and they were coming as a favor to individual members of the faculty. And it was really important to Northeastern because we were only like the third class since they had reopened after being closed for 20 years. And we had a reputation of being a night school that was closed. And they said, oh, we have these brilliant young law students who are gonna argue for you. So they walked out in disgust. And they came back in and they said, we're gonna rule in favor of the Commonwealth despite their argument, not because of it. So Ann and I won. And here's the final piece of what our class was like. And we had written, and I'm sure Bob and Brook had helped with the verses, we wrote a song called I've Looked at Law from Both Sides Now. From win and lose, and still somehow, it's law's illusions we recall. We really don't like law at all. And all our friends and family joined us.
Thank you, Liz. That was a lot of interesting history. We love it. We love it.
I haven't seen him skinny dipping since.
Margaret Wu. Margaret, there you go. I'm not even going to top that, Margaret, but let's see.
Okay, thank you. So my job is in one page to take you all up to 1989. So my name is Margaret Wu, and I'm a longtime colleague of Brooks at Northeastern. And I joined the faculty in 1989 to co-teach Brooks' infamous legal practice course, the precursor to the present-day LSSC, Legal Skills in Social Contexts. And it was a foundational course for every first-year law student at Northeastern. And these initial years, Brooke, have now morphed into 40 years of collegial friendship where I've laughed and learned alongside Brooke. Now, for those of you who don't know me, my other specialty is also comparative law, focusing on China's evolving legal system. And the People's Republic often has slogans to cajole its citizens, such as the three represents, right? That is, the party must represent China's development, advanced culture, and fundamental interests of the people. Another slogan is the three supremes. Chinese courts must regard as supreme the people's cause, the people's interests, and the people's constitution. Now, from working closely with Brooke, I also know that Brooke has 3 commitments. And these 3 commitments are, Brooke is committed to pedagogy and students, to the public interest, and of course, to basketball. So, pedagogy. Brooke is a scholar, but he doesn't linger on abstract theories. Before his work on public health, which you will hear from a number of people, online as well as in person, Brooke devoted his scholarship and pedagogy. And his scholarship on the importance of practice-based learning have appeared in such prestigious publications as the NYU Law Review, as the Clinical Law Review, the Journal of Legal Education. He urged us to value doing over talking in a student's learning, and guiding rather than lecturing in our teaching. And he never wavered from those beliefs, and he has advanced the field substantially. And importantly, Brooks' devotion to his student is legendary. His office door is always open, even beyond office hours, right? Students can walk by any time during the day, poke their head in, count on a friendly hello and a concerned check-in. Brooke knows his students, and he can be counted on to be a presence at all student events, taking in that part of his job goes beyond the classroom and beyond the normal 9 to 5. Public interest. You are going to hear a lot more about this in the subsequent speakers. His public interest in the area of public health expands beyond the borders of the US to international work. And I won't linger on it. Rather, I'm going to focus on basketball, his true love. So for many years, once a week, Brooke would spearhead a pickup basketball game with his students. And alums would speak fondly of how the normally smiling Brooke would be transformed into a fierce and scary competitor on the court. No longer spewing cooperation, Brooke will elbow, steal, and dunk his way to victory. And alums such as Maura Healy, Mo Cowan could attest to it. He's passionate about playing and watching the game. Now that Brooke is retiring, I'm certain he will pick up new commitments, but I hope he won't forget his old ones. I'm certain that the classroom will still be open for him to return and teach the occasional course, and the basketball court is still waiting for his games. provided that the Celtics is not in the playoffs, in which case I think he'll be watching it rather than playing. So thank you.
Thanks, Margaret, for that. So now we have video presentations from Greg Gonsalves and Yosef Valda.
Dear Brooke, I'm sorry I can't be there tonight. I'm heading out west tomorrow for the start of a sabbatical. The second half of that sabbatical is in Boston, so I'll have to take you out for a drink to celebrate your retirement in early 2025. I've known you for at least 20 years, because when I started working on global access to antiretroviral therapy, you were already there. And in effect, you were the intellectual engine of the movement, using your prodigious talents to take the goals of our collective activism and turn it into extensively documented, analytically rigorous papers, both formal academic ones and those for organizations like your beloved Health Gap. All your work now stands as a historic achievement and a record of our collective accomplishments together. But I have newfound respect for you after taking up an academic job a few years ago. No one does what you do. Well, few, if any, people I know have devoted their careers to a scholarly activism in the way you have, completely, passionately, uncompromisingly. Universities are conservative institutions in the end, reproducing the status quo of power, and your vision stands as a rebuke to a profession that should do more to serve the people of this world. It seems to always collapse into a narrow set of tiny objectives: write more papers, get more grants, wash, rinse, repeat. All I wish is that I could be more like you. All of us in academia could be more like you. You're a role model in your fusion of knowledge and intellect, a drive towards fairness and justice, and a special gift for taking these hallowed halls and putting them at the service of the greater good. Congratulations, Brooke. See you soon.
Greetings to everyone from Cape Town, South Africa, and special greetings to Brooke and Judith. I'm Katie Vauda.
And I'm Yusuf Vauda. Our relationship with the Bakers goes back 27 years, during which time Brooke and I have collaborated in teaching clinical law and later in teaching and activism around access to medicines in South Africa and the global South. Brooke and Judith were for a long time annual visitors to our home, and we spent many hours talking and strategizing on how to remove intellectual property and other barriers to equitable access to medicines and health. Brooke, of course, is an international leader in the access movement, and I personally benefited greatly from his wisdom, experience, and knowledge, which he shared most generously.
We've been privileged to know Brooke as a wonderful friend, brother, comrade, and much-loved uncle to our children. And what do we like about him? That he's part of our lives in all these different ways, that he's a joyful walking and birding companion, and that he both cooks and eats like a champ.
Our favorite thing about Brooke is his deep compassion for humanity, which informs his every interaction. We wish Brooke and Judith everything of the best in this next phase of their lives.
That was wonderful, and also a great testament to Brooke's connections globally, and the connection between your experiential education background and the work you've been doing. Next we have Asia Russell. Asia?
Thank you. Brooke is a man of surprises, which means I did not really know that I was going to speak to him. My name is Asia Russell. I'm the executive director of a group called Health Gap. Health Gap, perhaps you can raise your hand if you have the experience of Brooke having seen social injustice in his community and responded to it by creating a world. Please raise your hand if you've seen that. So picture it. It's 20 years ago and a little change, 1999. 90% of people with HIV had no access to transformative, life-saving antiretroviral treatment that was finally available to a certain extent for some communities, not necessarily all, in the United States, in Europe, and in Japan. 90% of people had no access. And worse than that, the duty bearers who had an obligation to provide access were excusing needless death. Perhaps as the class of '76, you can relate to this injustice. I was born in 1976. That's how I know the class of 1976. And I think what's unique about Brook Baker is he understands the entire cosmos starts in one person. And if we transform the orientation of one person to political power, we create change. And sometimes we're lucky enough that change actually results in revolution. And I don't use that word lightly. Remember, I was born in 1976. I thought things could never get worse than Ronald Reagan. Honestly, I was raised by social justice activists, and I thought, this man will never be the worst. I thought that. Then I saw welfare get dismantled by Bill Clinton. The welfare that raised me as a child, as a working class child, dismantled by a Democrat. That helped me understand the cosmology that we all exist in and that we have transformed and that Brook Baker continues to transform. So, think about it. 1999, I meet this person who is brilliant enough not just to be sane as an academic, as a scholar, and as a public health leader, that it is unacceptable, it is racist, it is unjust that human beings could be denied access to life-transforming, life-saving antiretroviral therapy, but that the law has to be used as an instrument to dismantle that deadly system. We realized we had a comrade and we found each other. And I think the other final important point to make is when we look around, so many academics are self-serving, are focused on recreating their own access, gatekeeping. Think about the contrast with the National Lawyers Guild. That energy of holding open the gates so that the next generation of directly impacted communities can not only be pushing for transformative social justice, but also can be occupying the academy and graduating as professors, holding the instruments of power, whether on the streets or in the ivory tower. When Brook showed us at Health Gap that that was possible, that it was possible to embody that kind of spirit and that drive in one human, we realized we had a comrade for life. And I guess in closing, I think Brook understands better than anyone that with every tiny, incremental, transformative bit of progress we've been able to extract, whether that's the fact that today 75% of people who have HIV have access to treatment. I know, I know because Brook is a comrade. He's not resting. The thing that haunts him at night is that 25% of people have no access. And that the tools of law and the instruments of academia can actually be brought to bear alongside the tools of community organizing, the tools of social justice, so that we can deliver not just a defeat of this plague and a defeat to the needless death that has haunted all of us, but a day when health justice is actually realized for everyone, no matter their HIV status, no matter their gender, no matter their sexual orientation, no matter whether they're struggling with addiction, that we'll actually be able to use a wedge of the law, of privileged understanding of the law, to ensure that we all have access to equitable health services, and to lives lived with dignity around the world. I think the thing that Brook was always willing to say, no matter whether he was in Geneva at another boring meeting where he was speaking truth to power when no one else had the courage to, or whether he was on the front lines of a protest dressed up as a pharma profiteer, is that he understood that all of those tactics mattered. They mattered because they confronted the people who had power with the outcomes of their decisions to turn their backs on the people whom they worked for. And that kind of raw energy and commitment comes from lawyers at their best. I know that because I've been privileged to know people who've represented folks as public defenders, people who've done legal work alongside those who've committed civil disobedience, like many of us in this room, people who understand their instruments acting in commitment to social justice. So I guess I just want to raise the microphone and honor and pay tribute to Comrade Brook. He's an AIDS warrior. He's a warrior in the fight for social justice. And I know because of the people around me tonight, he's touched so many people with his transformative commitment to an understanding of a world where even at the height of privilege, we can turn around and do the brave thing, the thing that's most difficult, and fight and fight and fight and never, ever give up. So thank you, Brook. Thank you.
Thank you, Asia. That was amazing and impromptu as well. If I ever need a speech, I'll call you up. So next we have Joya McCurdy. Joya?
I've had this unfortunate position often of speaking after Asia. But I want to also talk about the movement, our movement. The movement for HIV treatment access is where many of us found a home with our radical activism in the 80s and the 90s. And there is no more esteemed title that you can have in any social movement than a movement elder. And Brook is our movement elder, and we are so grateful to that, Brook. I also want to shout out Judith, who has always been in the struggle with Brook. And Brook and Judith dropped these things that for those of us who are younger, and I'm not as young as Asia, but younger, we worked with SDS, and we worked in South Africa after apartheid, and it's just like this casual thing. They are movement elders. They have been in it. They have been fighting for social justice, and that has been a balm to so many of us who have been fighting in a time that was very conservative. We didn't grow up in the 60s. We didn't grow up with popular protest. So we had to kind of start from scratch. And having people like Brook and Judith in our corner fighting for us. Brook mentioned I was a baby when we met 25 years ago. And I wasn't. I was in my 30s. But I was a baby in terms of the fight. Because I grew up with a lot of privilege. And I saw a world around me broken. I had worked in Africa and Uganda, a place that Brook and Asia so love, in the mid-90s. And in that 2 years that I lived there in rural Uganda, I went to 250 funerals. And each and every person had died of complications of HIV. And that was 1994, and I returned to the United States as a physician. I'm a physician in infectious disease, internal medicine, and pediatric physician. And that year, this amazing cocktail of drugs that would turn people from corpses to living in the world was discovered, 1995. And friends like Greg Gonzalez had a second life because of that. Friends like David Barr, friends like Mark Harrington, all of whom are in the movement. Many of us were fighting together in the 90s, in the late 80s, for discovery of new drugs, for access to new drugs. We believed in this so much. And when I came back from Uganda, there was a conference in Vancouver that said, "One world, one hope." We have these drugs, now let's bring them to 95% of the 26 million people on the planet who are living with HIV. And everyone said no. Too expensive. Africans can't tell time, they don't wear watches, they won't be able to take their medicine, they're unreliable. And I joined a tiny little organization called Partners in Health, led by my dear departed friend, Paul Farmer, in 1999, because, and only because, they were treating a handful of patients with HIV in Haiti. And everybody thought we were nuts. Everybody scoffed at us. We wrote papers in the Lancet and the WHO bulletin saying, look, we've treated 50 patients with HIV with these drugs. And people said, that's stupid, it's gold-plated, they'll never be able to stay. They will never be able to stay because they're black, because they're poor, because they're Haitian. But people like Brook, who had seen the struggle in South Africa, people like Judith, and many activists like Greg and later Asia said, no, they have something. They're saying that with solidarity, with accompaniment, with support, you can actually help people to live a normal life. And in fact, we must. This is the civil rights movement of our time. And there was no greater privilege for me as a physician to be a tiny part of that movement. And I remember meeting Brook for something called, I had to look it up because I forgot, Task Force Number 5. Pretty dull, right? Pretty dull. That was something that came out of the Millennium Development Goals, this heady idea in 2000, 2001, that we as a community could do better for the poor, that we could stand in solidarity, not in charity, but solidarity. And that task force number 5 was infectious disease access to medicines. And I thought, there's no way. And Brook said, oh yeah, no, we got this. There is a way. It's called TRIPS. I had no idea what that was. Trade-related aspects of intellectual property. He laid it out for me. He trained other lawyers to write this constitutional documents so that each and every country on the African continent and Haiti could say, actually, this is a national emergency. We demand these drugs. And those lawsuits went forward, and country after country started bringing in generic drugs. When I started this fight, in 1994, 1995, there were fewer than 50,000 people on the African continent that had access to HIV therapy. Fewer than 50,000 out of 25 million. Everybody was dying. Every day was a funeral. Kids were being orphaned. And today, there are 30 million people who are receiving access to antiretroviral therapy. And Brook Baker has a percentage of that 30 million. Because without the law, without the understanding of patents, without the understanding of international trade policy, we could not have gotten there. Goodwill did not work. Data, scientific data did not work. The only thing that worked was the movement. So while I never was part of the skinny dipping, I did have one of our many activist friends staying at my house talking about a naked action that they had in Washington, D.C. against PEPFAR. This was Jennifer Flynn Walker. And the next time I saw Brook, I said, were you at that? She said, no. So I believe him. But what Brook taught me is that movements are made up of people, and they're made up of the collective and different power of people, from the law to medicine to experience with the community to families that can make dinners and host us in their homes, to so many people. And to me, what you are, and to so many of us, Brook, and you can't retire from this position, is the movement elder. So thank you so much for always welcoming all of us into the movement that you helped to create.
Thank you. That was wonderful. And one of the things that Brook said to me when we were discussing his retirement and quotes, he's like, "Now, James, I'm still going. You know, I'm still going to be very much active, but in a different context. But also, definitely will make sure that you remain connected to Northeastern." Now, I'm going to turn the mic over to Gary Baker. Gary?
Thank you. I'll start off by saying Judith told me I had 3 to 5 minutes. And as you might expect, Judith had a big part in organizing this, and she's had a big part in organizing Brook's life. And I've watched that from afar and from a close perspective for many years. My perspective on Brook and the wonderful things that you've heard about him today is very different. And I'll try and give you not necessarily a funny, but a perspective of how he got to where he is. And I've been trained in public speaking. I've done public speaking as a government executive, and 3 points are what you're supposed to have in a speech. So I've got 3 points. The first is that we are twins. Brook is 6 minutes older than I am, 2 inches taller, 20 pounds more. And that was just the beginning. We competed in academics, in sports, in almost every aspect you can expect, as twins would, from essentially the time we were born until we graduated from high school. And I was 18, and I said, "I'm going south to school, you go north, we'll meet again sometime in the future." But we did graduate from a relatively small school, went to the same school from kindergarten through 12th grade. And as you might expect, Brook was number 1 in our class. Straight A's, wonderful. I was told on one of the days near the end of our school year in my senior year by the parent of one of the other students, "Congratulations, Gary, you came in second in class." Well, I had no idea. I wasn't paying any attention to it. But so we were number 1 and we were number 2. And so as valedictorian, salutatorian, we had to make speeches, which was the first speech I ever made in my life and the scariest. But our topic was competition. And we lived that competition, and we each gave our perspective on competition. My perspective was striving to try and catch Brook most of the time. I didn't say that specifically, but and Brook was on the value of competition. So that's the first point, competition. It leads somewhat to the second point, which is excellence. You've heard about the excellence that Brook brings to everything that he does. Our father was a mentor, a trainer. He was difficult in many ways, more difficult for Brook than for me, but as kind of a plebeian way of talking about how we were trained for excellence, he would have us wash the family car on Saturdays. Now, for me, part of doing the job was doing it as expeditiously as possible. For Brook, it was, I recognize that, but I know you've got to do it very thoroughly so that Father doesn't come back and look at this part of the car or that part and say, "You've got to do that part over again." Well, I got to do many parts over again.